I would let John take up the floor and give his introduction as well, and a small introduction on what's happening right now in Indian economy before we can start asking some very specific questions to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Gurtegh. So by way of introduction, I thought I'll just very briefly share some of the frustration that I feel at the end of this week when the budget was presented and received raving reviews from most of the so-called experts who are actually lobbyists commenting on this budget, which actually doesn't have much for poor people in my view. The tone was set by the economic survey tabled the day before, which basically said that everything is fine and that the economy has fully recovered from the COVID crisis, which is pretty harsh if you think of it, because poor people have really had a hard time in the last few years in India. Things were not going so badly for them until 2016. The economy had grown at about 7.5% per year for as long as 12 years, which is quite unusual, very unusual in fact. And the wages were rising, not very fast, but they were rising. And there had also been a major expansion of many major social programs. The Employment Guarantee Act was put in place in rural areas, the National Food Security Act. There were big increases in allocations for child nutrition programs, social security pensions, maternity benefits, and so on and so forth. And then in 2016, Modi pulled the plug on the economy. I wrote at that time that it was like shooting at the tires of a racing car. And that's more or less how it turned out, because from then on, the growth of the economy slowed down year after year before the COVID crisis. And according to a recent study by CSDS, the wages stopped rising in real terms, which is, I think, is a very important indicator. I think real wages we should pay much more attention to, instead of all these useless unemployment rates that apply only to a small section of the workforce. So the wages more or less stopped rising. They were not rising very fast in the first place. And then, of course, in early 2020, the COVID crisis came. 20% of the population didn't earn anything at all for months during the extended lockdown that began at the end of March 2020, one of the harshest in the world. Tens of millions of migrant workers were first marooned thousands of kilometers from their homes for a long time, and then had to somehow return home by whatever means. When the lockdown was relaxed, many of them had to walk or cycle long distances. When they came back, there were no jobs for them, except to some extent under the Employment Guarantee Act in rural areas. And then there were other catastrophic aspects to the crisis. The health crisis, of course, with millions of people dying, not necessarily directly of COVID, but excess mortality in millions over the 2 years. We don't know exactly how many million, but maybe something between 2 and 5 million. Certainly a lot more than the official estimates. And then the catastrophic schooling crisis, which has received very little attention, with the schools being closed for the best of 2 years. In some states like Jharkhand, where I live, 2 years at a stretch, the world record of longest school closures, and very little, if anything, being done to help the vast majority of children who are not able to study online during that period, because the privileged children were studying online in the comfort of their homes. So for them, everything was fine. And therefore, there was very little pressure for the system to do something for the other children. After that, 22, 23, we don't really know what happened to poor people, partly because the statistical system in the meantime has been comprehensively demolished with the discontinuation of the consumption expenditure surveys of the NSS, discontinuation of a number of other surveys like the district household level surveys, the annual health surveys, and so on. But according to data presented in the economic survey itself, the wages have not risen at all again in the last 2 years. So if you string that with the earlier study, it means no increase in wages since 2016, which is quite alarming. So anyway, that's the background. And then we have this budget. For the first time, I listened to the entire budget speech of the finance minister. And I was really shocked to see that she makes absolutely zero reference to poverty, unemployment, inflation, wages, purchasing power. You can search for these keywords in her speech. They're not mentioned even once. So poor people have basically been ignored in the speech and to a large extent in the budget itself. And then she came up with this new, very interesting term, the hard-working middle class, with which she identifies. She had said a few days earlier that she identified with the middle class and counted herself as part of it, which is quite interesting because it reveals that this term is actually a propaganda term. It really means the privileged class, but we can't say privileged class, so we call it the middle class, because she must be part of the probably top 1% or certainly 5% of the income scale. So to say that you belong to the middle class and that to the hardworking middle class, when you're actually right at the top, is quite something. So corresponding to this ignoring of poor people in the speech, the budget itself was pretty harsh on poor people, I think. There was a massive cut in the allocation for the Employment Guarantee Act. The food subsidy has been also drastically reduced because the bonus food rations that had been initiated during the COVID crisis were discontinued on the 1st of January of this year. And despite the overall budget increasing quite a lot, I mean, the budget is now 45 lakh crores, which is something like, I think, if I'm not mistaken, something like $500 billion, compared to 35 lakh crores 2 years ago. So there's a lot of extra money, at least in money terms and to a large extent even in real terms. But the budgets of many critical social programs have been reduced, if not in money terms, then in real terms. That applies not just to NREGA especially, but also to child nutrition programs, social security pensions, maternity benefits, and of course the food subsidy. And the interesting thing is that all this passed without any comments in all these discussions that came after the budget. Of course, the opposition parties criticized the budget, but that's what they are expected to do. So it doesn't really carry much weight. But there was very little informed criticism of this attack on the entire social security system. And I think it's really a loss. And this is actually another step in that direction. It's not new. I mean, it has been going on for a while. For example, if you look at child nutrition programs like the midday meals and the integrated child development services, which in my view is one of the most important, if not the most important social program of the government of India. In real terms, the budget now is 40% less than in 2014. I mean, it's an extraordinary cut in very critical children's programs and passing without any comments. So I think it's a pity that we are seeing this sustained attack on what was beginning to resemble useful foundations of a social security system for India. Of course, the benefits of these programs are very small, but you can expand them over time. And if you look at these programs together, I think they had the promise of moving towards reasonably solid foundations for a social security system of a rather unique kind. Very few developing countries have this bunch of social security schemes, including a Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which is virtually unique in the world, and other provisions like, for example, universal maternity benefits under the National Food Security Act. Very small, I mean, 6,000 rupees per birth is very little, but the principle that every pregnant woman has a right to some form of social support is very important. and very few developing countries have that sort of provision. So it's the idea behind all this is that every citizen has an entitlement to social security. It's not just the organized working class.